Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is @CloseTalking. I am @JackRossiterMunn, and Connor is @ConnorMStratton. On Instagram, the show is @CloseTalkingPoetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CloseTalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show.
Hello, and welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking.
My name is Ozymandias.
Oh my god. All right, we really haven't introduced the concept. Jesus. Well, that was Jack Rossiter Munley.
I think I was clear that I'm Ozymandias.
All right. So, what Jack would have told you if he was a reasonable co-host, which he is not, as I am your other much more reasonable co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton, we're going to talk about the poem Ozymandias, which is by the great romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Hey, Connor.
What?
Connor. What did my boy PBS say to people when he did something naughty?
Oh, I don't know.
I'm a bad bitch.
Oh, God. We gotta cut that.
Hey, Connor. My boy PBS, you know he loved those club tracks, right?
Oh, no.
What was his favorite banger from the Romantic era?
Don't tell me it was Bish Don't Kill My Vibe.
No.
Oh.
It was old-timey Britney Spears' Work Bish. Yeah. Okay. So welcome to Close Talking. This has been something I really wanted to do. Because I
just for the jokes, not even for the poem, just for the Bish jokes.
I mean, well, I was referring specifically to playing the clip of someone saying I am Ozymandias instead of saying my real name when we started the episode.
Oh yeah, that happened. I already blocked that out.
Yes, and Connor is the language of good co-hosting and
right.
Also improv.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, welcome to Close Talking. I am Jack Rossiter Munley, co-host of Close Talking, not Ozymandias, King of Kings, but we are talking about the poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley today. Things to love about Percy Bysshe Shelley. One, initials are PBS. It's pretty sweet. He's a romantic poet and hung out with all the cool dudes from the Romantic era, writing really passionate stuff. Another thing, his works are in the public domain. You can listen to people read them for free on LibriVox. We're going to provide you a bunch of links to that, and you should definitely take advantage of it. Less cool is that he died when he was 29. That's kind of sad. But before he did that, he managed to marry Mary Shelley, so his wife was smarter than he was, which is always kind of cool. He also wrote some pretty groundbreaking works about nonviolent protest, which is a whole other thing that he didn't get recognized for. Yeah, really foundational philosophical treatises on the topic.
Wow.
So yeah, all around cool guy. This poem he wrote because he and his friend had a write-off, and his friend lost. Poor Horace Smith, who also wrote a poem, a sonnet-like poem about Ozymandias, which is good for my boy PBS because it brings his lifetime reading challenge total to 1-1 because on a particularly, so he and Mary like went away for the summer together but it was an unseasonably cold summer. There's like a bunch of records about how cold the summer was, and they had a like couples write-off because they're both writers, and he wrote, I mean, probably some good stuff. He's a cool dude, but she wrote Frankenstein. So
Yeah.
he definitely lost that write-off. Yeah. So it's good that he kind of took the cake on this one.
Both poems, including the one that we'll read, is about a real statue of a king in ancient Egypt.
Right. So Ozymandias is the Greek name for the individual who is widely recognized as the person who was pharaoh when Egypt was at the height of its power, Ramses II. And so there was a statue of Ramses II that was discovered in Egypt and was making its way to London around the time both of these poems were written. And Shelley's is good, and his friend's is charitably, I'm going to say, not remembered as fondly for a reason. Poor Horace Smith.
His friends, the title of his poem was so bad.
So Horace Smith tragically called his poem,
On a Stupendous Leg of Granite, discovered standing by itself in the deserts of Egypt, with the inscription inserted below.
Yikes.
I mean, it's like, I know that James Wright was going to come along with the cool long titles, but that was many years to come, and this one is just quite bad.
The thing about those long titles also is that, as you noted, they're cool. And this one is, this one's just
with
long.
The inscription inserted below is like never end any title that way, I think.
Like, are you an archaeologist describing your find? What is this? Show don't tell, my dude. Show don't tell. Did no one ever tell you this, Horace? So anyway, PBS did a good job, and we're going to talk about his poem because he really nailed it and wrote something that people have remembered, and we'll hopefully get a little bit to the reasons why. I'm going to read it, I think, is the first thing. Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
That's cool.
Skabloosh. Pretty good. So the poem itself is like kind of supposed to be a sonnet. It's like not totally an iambic pentameter, and the rhyme scheme is real funky, but
it's a sonnet.
It's a sonnet. The rhyme scheme, for those of you playing along at home, is ABABA CDCEDEFEF.
It's kind of funky.
Which I personally like because the rhymes then become more fun than like a really, we've talked before about kind of loud forms, and I feel like it keeps the sonnet form from being so loud in the poem, and it lets the poem just on the kind of on the subject of it remaining relevant. It makes it feel a little bit less old-timey.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And the other part, so it is 14 lines, and also the other big characteristic of a sonnet is the volta, or the turn, which traditionally happens between the 8th and the 9th line. And that happens in this one pretty clearly, because the first 8 lines sort of describe the statue, and then the 9th line is on the pedestal, these words appear, and it sort of gets to what was written on the pedestal. And so that's like a pretty clear volta there. But you're right, the kind of, it's interesting that the rhyme scheme is almost like 6 and then 8, but the lines themselves are like 8 and then 6. So there's a sort of like interlocking that you wouldn't normally have between the sort of the lines and the rhyme scheme, which is, I think, is pretty cool.
I agree. I think something else that kind of almost works against the form is the way that different voices are used in the poem, because those also do not break along the normal lines of, as you were saying, the volta usually comes in a particular place. That's not going on here, and neither is the way that the voices switch in the poem.
Yeah, it's, I met a traveler from an antique land, that's the first line, and then it's who said, and then the quote begins and continues for the end of the line. Yeah, no, I think that's really one of the most striking parts of the poem. It sort of reminds me of Plato's Symposium, which might be a bit of a stretch, but that was, well, I mean, it's kind of about love, I guess. But the premise is that there's like a party, and Socrates is like asking everyone, like, how do you define love, basically. But the interesting part about it is that there's like, it's like Plato is like, Socrates told me this, but then in the party, it's like someone's like, well, I was, like walking home, and then this guy ran into me, and then he was like, I just heard from this other person this theory about love. And so you end up with like this theory about love that's like 7 people removed from your actual experience. And that's kind of sort of similar in this, where, you have the sculptor's words and kind of Ozymandias's words, and then you have the traveler's words, and then you have the speaker's words, and then you have the reader reading it. So it's like, you have to take like sort of 3, 4 sort of steps to get most inward. We can return to that, but I think it's a very striking choice that the poem makes.
That gave me a thought, because what sort of happens in the Symposium is it almost democratizes the answers, and it makes them coming from more places, and it's more accumulated wisdom. Whereas part of the way I think this functions in the poem Ozymandias is it reaffirms the greatness of the figure that is now departed, because you have all of these people still talking about a sculpture of a big time dude, basically like a king of kings, as he himself calls himself. Part of the poem is the fact that like this statue no longer stands, but the desert remains, and all of the works he refers to are not visible. However, everybody's talking about this guy, and you get a sense of the far-reaching impact. And by having these multiple layers, they're all pointing back to a singular figure, which is the title of the poem, Ozymandias. It's about this guy, and he might represent hubris or overreach, and the lone and level sands are for lack of a better word, a leveling factor on his boastful claims. But because everybody's talking about him and his big statue, you get a sense of this enduring great figure.
That is fascinating. I think we'll have much to discuss. But first, I think perhaps we should do what I probably too often do, which is just to like go through the poem, in part because this is like 201 years old, which is kind of cool. But it means that the language is it's old, and it's even difficult for me to comprehend at times, just on the sort of the basic level. So the first part is pretty obvious. I met a traveler from an antique land. Okay. And then the traveler speaks, two vast and trunkless legs of stone. So we get these big stone blocks that are like the legs of the statue, I guess, that are standing in the desert. Then near those legs of stone, also in the desert on the sand, there's a visage. So his face, the face of the king or the pharaoh, is sort of like sunken in the sand. And the face, you can sort of still read the expression on the face. So it's got a frown, it's got a wrinkled lip, it's got a sneer of cold command. And I think here we're getting some sense of like the things that Jack was talking about, of this sort of overreaching hubris guy. Like, he's got this sneer. Anyway, he has a certain sort of ruler contempt for people. At least that's one way to read the expression.
The statue is of a pharaoh. The pharaohs were considered to be gods who walked amongst men, even a heightened version even of what we think of as the divine right of kings, because the pharaohs were truly thought to be gods. But if you want even like the modern sense of what this is like, watch the episode of The Crown where Elizabeth is anointed with holy oils and their discussion of how that moment goes, because even in the 1950s, they're talking about not necessarily literally, but how important it is to preserve the idea that the monarch is anointed by God. So in terms of any sort of like hubristic thoughts, this is also the society this person is placed in, and that's why there are these god renderings of pharaohs.
Also, if you watch Scandal, note how many times the president says, "I am the president of the United States of America." Like it's supposed to be, that's all you need to say.
It's a get out of jail free card. Take that, Millie. I sleep with who I want. I'm the president of the United States of America.
But guys, I'm the president of the United States of America.
That's so gross.
Anyway, after the cold command, gets, I think, a little tricky. So near them on the sand, there's the visage lies. Tell that its sculptor well those passions red, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. So here we get in this awkward English syntax, which now if anyone did it, it would be like you're just doing that for the rhyme, because it's like tell that its sculptor read those passions well would be like probably a more direct saying it, but you wanted the red to come after. But I think that sort of inversion was less weird at that time. But it's kind of like saying that the expression that remains on the face shows that the sculptor is like a good at sort of like conveying the passions or the vibe of the pharaoh, which has been accurate rendering, which are stamped, on the lifeless, stone. And then it says the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And this, I think, and I'm curious what you think, at least I read somewhere that this is sort of what it refers to, that the hand is the sculptor's hand, the hand that mocked them. Mock actually has sort of two meanings. One is the what we would understand is like it's making fun of kind of thing. But the other is just like if you do a mock-up of something, it's just a literal neutral term for what a sculptor might do in sort of making a face.
Yeah, it's almost like an imitation.
Yeah, exactly, an imitation. The heart that fed, who in God's knows what that means. Let's skip that for now.
I think the heart that fed is indicating that the sculptor felt a connection to the subject, and that's why not just the reality of the features, but we're told in the lines before that the sculptor read the passions of the person, and so it's the heart that fed the work that could understand this great ruler well enough to not just put his features, but something of his personality into the lifeless stone.
I still have some questions, but I think we can get to those questions later. So then we've sort of completed our description of the most of the sort of like the sculpture itself, and we get to our volta, and we turn, pivot, and it goes, and on the pedestal, these words appear. So now it's the words that are inscribed on the stone of the pedestal. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. He's the king. He's like, look at my stone sculpture of myself. I'm like a boss. You should feel weak and despair at your lameness and smallness.
That is a paraphrasing of what historian Diodorus Siculus said was written on an actual statue. The inscription is translated as, King of Kings, Ozymandias am I. If any want to know how great I am and where I lie, let him outdo me in my work.
So he's taken a creative liberty, this Shelley, but that's actually pretty close. So yeah, that's very interesting. It's like interesting that there's this poem is like historical to us, but it's also dealing with something even more historical.
Don't tell Siculus, but I like PBS's version better.
I won't. That could just be a bad translation of the Latin, though.
Fair enough.
But then after the words on the pedestal, we return to the traveler talking, describing, and he says, nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So basically, around this wreck of a sculpture, this ruin, there's nothing but the infinite desert. That's like what happens in the poem. And you were sort of talking about, this is sort of interesting, the fact of all the distancings, of like Ozymandias's words, the sculptor's words, the traveler's words, the speaker's words, speaks to the durability of Ozymandias, which I think is right. And I think that the sort of critical consensus with which I can gather, the idea of durability or permanence or sort of like legacy is a kind of central concern of the poem. But I think that, and this was, I read a bit about this, I think on the Poetry Foundation website, which has a helpful poem guide to this poem. They really, shout out to the Poetry Foundation, their descriptions of both some poems like this and poets are like so good. I recommend that you read that because, especially for the more like canonical ones, they're basically like critical summaries where it's like a Wikipedia page, but like actually helpful and with analysis. It's like so amazing. So the Poetry Foundation thing about this poem, as Jack noted about his nonviolent protests, apparently Shelley was a real anti-authoritarian. He like hated rulers and monarchs, which I could really relate to these days, especially. This writer reads it, is the last three lines are sort of an important, very important moment in the poem. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And I'm curious what you think about this, but this writer writes, Shelley's final lines with their picture of the surrounding desert are his attempt to remove himself from both the king and the sculptor, to assert an uncanny, ironic perspective superior to the battle between ruler and ruled that contaminates both. Which is kind of wild. Anyway, but that what we're left with in the poem, even though it's about Ozymandias, is the desert and the infinite sands. And the sands are kind of like described it's very interesting, you know, it's like nothing beside remains, which is a sort of the shortest sentence in the poem. Decay, wreck, and then boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. There's the emptiness in the bare and the lone and the sort of solitude, but there's also the infiniteness of it, the boundlessness, the levelness. It's like a present absence, in some kind of way, which is maybe a bad phrase to use, but
no, it's a great phrase to use that has me thinking all kinds of things.
Anyway, so I'm curious because it feels like I believe what you say, and that is like a really good case for why we have this super distancing. But then on the same end, I find that reading plausible, at least in terms of why do we end with the desert? So I'm curious what you think about that.
I agree that the success of this poem lies largely in those last 3 lines. And I think that the distancing of voices building up how great Ozymandias clearly was, and Ozymandias himself as one of those voices through the sculptor saying, I made a bunch of really big, important, cool stuff. You better freak out about it, you puny mortals. The ironic twist that those last 3 lines put on it, number one, is a very modern perspective to have on something. And I think is part of the reason why the poem endures, and the ways that the poem is often deployed in popular culture are based around the irony of those last 3 lines. So like the ads for the last season of Breaking Bad, the second half of its 5th season, were just atmospheric shots of deserts in and around Albuquerque and like Walter White's house and the RV, and Bryan Cranston reading this poem really dramatically in his awesome Bryan Cranston voice, which you may or may not have heard a little bit of at the beginning of this podcast when I pretended to be Ozymandias. But the way that the poem is being used there is after Walter White, minor spoilers for Breaking Bad, has said, I'm not in the meth business, I'm in the empire business. And there's even an episode entitled Ozymandias, and I'm going to let y'all guess what happens in that episode based on the contents of this poem and the ironic turn it takes.
Oh, no.
I know. Connor hasn't seen it yet.
I'm stressed. No, that's a great... Anyway, continue, yeah.
Yeah, another place where I know this was used is that Roger Federer lost in the 3rd round of the Australian Open in 2015, and he was like old and stuff, and everybody was like, oh my God, he's the most successful player ever, and he lost early. And there was an article written at that time with the title of Ozymandias, essentially saying like age and time gets to everyone and everything, no matter how glorious it once was, in reference to Roger Federer, who then proved all the haters wrong, reached 2 Grand Slam finals later that year, and then 3 years later is still one of the top-ranked tennis players in the world.
If you didn't know, Jack Russell-Munley is the biggest Roger Federer stan of all time.
Okay. You know what? Stan Wawrinka is a different tennis player from Switzerland who's also very successful in his own right, and he's a little bit tired of playing second fiddle to Roger Federer because he's also won 3 Grand Slams and like had his own awesome career and has maybe the best one-hand backhand in history. So like, step off with the putting Stan second.
Whoa.
Just kidding. I know it's a Twitter word. The point is, the way that this poem is often used leans into the irony of those last 3 lines, which, as I said, is a very modern perspective to take on something like the divine right of kings, which, as you were saying, PBS is not into, and he's not into monarchs and rules and like oppressive authoritarian power structures. He's a very forward-thinking guy in that regard. But I do still think that the distancing serves to build up Ozymandias initially, which then makes that turn of the last 3 lines and the irony it contains more powerful. Because even though this is the perspective the poem takes, you can't escape the fact that everybody is still talking about this guy thousands of years after he lived. And that indicates some kind of greatness in the works that he wrought, even if all that's left of them is this busted sculpture.
That's really interesting. The counter to that argument, which I think is right.
You think the counter is right, or you think I'm right? Because I'm ready to fight right now.
I think you are right, but I also think this is interesting. So the next part of the Poetry Foundation article and I swear that as soon as I read this, I'll have my own ideas. But I don't know if I will. Is that one thing that article notices is that even Ozymandias says, "Look on my works," not like "look on me," and that there's something enduring. But is it Ozymandias, or is it the kind of art or the sort of crafted things that commemorate him or are about him? And the kind of like end of that article on the Poetry Foundation, I mean, it gets a little. Anyway, here we go. The critic Leslie Brisman remarks on, quote, "the way the timelessness of metaphor escapes the limits of experience in Shelley." End quote. Timelessness can be achieved only by the poet's words, not by the ruler's will to dominate. The fallen titan Ozymandias becomes an occasion for Shelley's exercise of this most tenuous yet persisting form, poetry. Shelley's sonnet, a brief epitome of poetic thinking, has outlasted empires. It has witnessed the deaths of boastful tyrants and the decline of the British dominion he so heartily scorned. And just as a little addendum to this, reading that made me think of this essay that came out last spring, which was by the writer Alexander Chee. It's a great little essay, very moving, but it's called "On Becoming an American Writer." And one moment, sort of, he's kind of like talking about why he wants his students to sort of like actually think that writing is important, even though, so often we sort of consider it a trivial pastime or a luxury that, you can do if you get the chance or whatever. But Alexander Chee says, art is strength. And he said, I told them, as in my students, that I can't recall the emperors of China as well as I can Mencius, who counseled them, and whose stories of them, shared in his poetry of these rulers and their problems, describe them for me almost entirely. And the paradox of how a novel, should it survive, protects what a missile can't, I think is interesting.
I think that's super cool. And that is an interesting aspect of this poem, because it is the sculpture of Ozymandias that it's about, rather than anything particular to this dude. I think that's complicated a little bit because Ozymandias probably commissioned this sculpture. It kind of is one of his works. Not that I don't think that the reading about how his works are mostly vanished and that's like important. But he like probably said, make this big sculpture of me.
Yeah.
But also the fact that Ozymandias, or Ramses II, is a widely written about historical figure. And I don't know how true that was at the time, but like we remember him because he was the top pharaoh, and is as a result like a very good symbol of power, which is kind of how the poem works. I totally buy into the argument that the person on the Poetry Foundation website is making, and I agree with it. But I think there's also, I think my reading and that kind of sit alongside each other rather than being in any kind of conflict. I think they're sort of two sides of the same thing. I
may have created a brouhaha where there was not one.
That's okay. That's good. We can make up a clickbait title for this now.
Well, I think I have a synthesis to my false thesis antithesis thing.
All right, hit me with it, Hegel. What you got?
Well, it's just that, getting back to what you were talking about with the distancing, is one thing that does show is, as you were saying, sort of the enduringness of Ozymandias as a figure. But the other thing that shows is it it sort of makes explicit the way through which we sort of remember him and the way through which he endures, which is through language and through writing. So we sort of see in sort of like step by step, this poem isn't sort of a direct thing from Ozymandias. It's traveled, from Ozymandias to the sculptor, to the traveler, to Shelley, to us. And it's sort of traveled in all those ways, through language. And so he endures, and in the same way as that sort of the Alexander Chi was sort of talking about, the emperors of China endure, but they endure through the writing of Mencius. That's
I really like that, and I think that's really right. Because even within the poem, you see the different ways that Ozymandias wants to be remembered in writing, which is the inscription on the sculpture, versus the way that he is being remembered, both in the speaking of the traveler to the poet. I take it as to the poet, but to the person we meet at the beginning, the I in the poem. And then you also have the way that PBS put that all together in the poem as putting those three voices in conversation with each other. So you have Ozymandias' intention, you have the traveler's recollection, and then you have this whole condensation of those three views in one tight sonnet.
And to sort of bring it into the sonnet again as a form, one way to think about sonnets and the turn is like you often have a kind of argument in the sort of first half of poem, and then you have a kind of the turn is a sort of counter, and oftentimes in the couplet there's a sort of resolution, perhaps. As an example, in like Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, which is the one that I know and always quote, that's a classic Carpe Diem poem where it's like, I'm dying and you should love me. But the beginning part of the poem is I'm dying. It's like that time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves or none do hang, or few do hang. It's like an autumn, death, blah, blah, blah. And so that's kind of like the initial moment. And then the third quatrain, which happens sort of after the Volta, is a kind of intensification of that, where he's like death's second self. He's sort of burning on his own embers, basically, or the ashes of his youth doth lie, or something like that. So there's a kind of twist there. And then the couplet is like, this thou perceivest, and so that will make you love me, basically. In a similar but distinctly different way, this poem follows a sort of version of that, where the first 8 lines talk about the sculpture and describe sort of the sculptor, and pay attention to the ways in which the sculptor sort of themselves is like the one doing the work of making this enduring thing. Then we have the turn, that's the pedestal, and Ozymandias speaks in kind of like a counter you could almost have as the sculptor, look on my works, ye mighty in despair. And then the last 3 lines, which isn't quite the Shakespearean closing couplet, but is a kind of like, final turn, is, the description of the desert, and is in some ways like, probably, I think, even though in theory it's the traveler, I feel like it's when Shelley sort of emerges the most as like his voice speaking. And so he kind of like fits, we've been talking about all these different ways of thinking about these certain themes. And it's amazing, I think, that we can sort of talk about these big topics and then look at the poem again and be like, it's 14 lines long. It's, 10 syllables long, mostly. It's super compact. But I think the way that it gets its depth is in sort of in the turns themselves. They sort of allow that sort of space for bigger complicated themes to emerge.
I totally agree. And we said something similar about another short poem, Emily Dickinson's To Make a Prairie, where there are quite a few turns in like 35 words.
Yeah.
There's like three different, as we said at the time, there's three different answers to the implicit question of what does make a prairie. She gives you three different answers in like zero space. And so that makes the poem feel much bigger than it really is. And you're totally right. The same thing goes on here. It's a longer poem, but it's still a very short poem for the amount of depth that is drawn out. And some of that depth, I think, also just comes from the span of time that the poem engages with, because it is thousands of years of history and human creativity and artistry and empire building and falling that is condensed into this really tight space.
Yeah.
And even one of the people who's talking is a traveler. So he's telling you about his trip that he took. So there's even in the present day time, there's this person who is going around the world gathering experiences and relaying them. There's still a sense of an ever expanding universe that the poem is interested in talking about.
Exactly. I think that's really right. Emily Dickinson outdid him, I think, is the moral of the story.
As she does us all.
One other connection to make, which I wish I was more of a scholar and could do this better, but I do feel like this poem, and maybe someone has written about this, is participating in a lineage of poems that are basically about objects.
Perhaps like a poem about a Grecian urn.
Perhaps a Grecian urn. So I think this goes all the way back to Horace. In his odes, his ode 3, he wrote, which is a sort of now famous moment, I have built a monument more lasting than bronze, higher than the pyramid's regal structures, that no consuming rain nor wild north wind can destroy. And his monument he's referring to is his poetry. So there's kind of like the sort of inception of this idea of the poem as the immortal thing that sort of stands in tension to like the ephemeral material stuff of monuments. Then we get our Grecian urn. But there's sort of like, I think there's like a million sort of versions of this. Another kind of one that I wanted to read because it's a short one, but it's also interesting, is this Wallace Stevens poem called Anecdote of the Jar, which is in his first book, Harmonium. And it goes like this. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall, and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. Which is very interesting, and I think there's a lot going on there. But we have a kind of jar, which is like our Grecian urn, which is like our monument, which is like our sculpture of Ozymandias.
Could also be kind of similar to the red wheelbarrow upon which so much depends.
That's true. That is very true. Yes. And here, similarly, the jar kind of like makes the world bend to it. So it took dominion everywhere. You know, the wilderness rose up to it. It made the slovenly wilderness surround the hill. So it exerts this kind of force on nature, which has a sort of similar but like or parallel but different relationship to nature that the Ozymandias sculpture does to the desert. But an interesting one other interesting contrast is that the jar is distinctly sort of not grand. The jar was gray and bare, and it's in Tennessee, which, I mean, I don't think Stevens was like knocking Tennessee per se, but it's, it's not in the, it's not on the Nile of Egypt or some like sort of stereotypically, almost like fetishistically sort of grand locale. It's in some random hill in Tennessee. And so, yeah, to me, that's it. That's like, as you were saying, like Shelley has his sort of modern desert take, but at the same time is still confronting this sort of, sheer terror, maybe sublime terror of the ruin of Ozymandias or whatever, which has that kind of like romantic sensibility, capital R, that he was sort of a part of, even as he was skeptical of it, perhaps. While Stevens is in a kind of more distinctly modernist tradition, we would say, where, the sublime sort of isn't even something to be like reckoned with per se. And there's sort of like the ordinary stuffness of things. Yet there's still this kind of power. Anyway, I mean, it gets more complicated, but you could sort of, one could, I think, look at poems about jars throughout history and get an interesting sort of sense of the way that literature has sort of developed in its various paradigms.
That's super cool. I love all of that. Do you know what people used to chant at old-timey poetry slams when Horace was reading and a bunch of other poets were also reading?
I'm very stressed. What were they?
Don't bore us. Get to the Horace.
Oh, man.
They'd also shout Freebird. Because that transcends time.
Do you have any other thoughts?
I have one other thing that I wanted to tease out kind of quickly, and I don't know that it's something that it has a ton of depth to it, but it's something that I noticed and thought was kind of interesting, which is that there are 3 words that are not titles that are in the middle of sentences that are capitalized, which are works, mighty, and wreck. So if you want a really quick key to those last 3 lines and kind of to what the poem is getting at and saying is important, it's that someone who does mighty works, those mighty works will eventually get wrecked.
Yeah.
And that there is meaning in that. And that, I think, is sort of what the poem gets at. And those 3 words all come in the last 4 lines. 2 of them are part of the rephrased inscription on the sculpture, which are works and mighty. And then of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. I just thought that was kind of neat that PBS is pointing us so strongly in that direction.
Right. And it's a very that gives us sort of a sense that it really is Shelley's voice coming in at the end, because works and mighty are capitalized presumably on the inscription itself. The capitalization is like a visual note, but the traveler who's telling Shelley this presumably isn't going to be like, and that colossal wreck, which I tell you orally with a capital W, that's not the traveler talking. That is a distinctly Shelley choice. So I think that's right. That word is the big contrast to the mighty work. Cool.
Excellent. Shall we read it again?
Yes.
All right then. Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land, who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. And whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry. And we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything is possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.